Caroline Whitmore pressed her father's pocket watch against her chest the morning she walked into the courthouse to marry a man she had never loved. Her hands weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from fury. Because the man who forced her here, the man who called in her father's debt the morning after the funeral, was standing right outside that door smiling like he'd already won. If you're new here, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The pocket watch had stopped working 6 days ago. Caroline noticed it the same morning they lowered her father into the ground. The glass face cracked, the hands frozen at 7:42, and no matter how many times she wound the crown, nothing moved. She told herself it didn't matter. Watches broke. Men broke. Everything broke eventually on the Wyoming plains, where the summer heat came down so hard and flat, it turned the earth the color of old bone. But she kept winding it anyway. She was still winding it when Decker Hale's man slid the envelope under the ranch house door. She didn't open it right away. She knew what it was before she touched it. The paper was thick legal weight, the kind that came from a city office, and carried the smell of someone else's authority. She set it on the kitchen table and stood across from it for a long time. The way you stand across from something you know is going to hurt you, trying to decide whether knowing the damage ahead of time makes it hurt less. It didn't. The letter was 3 pages. It took her less than 2 minutes to read. Her father had borrowed against the land 3 years before he died. Borrowed against it twice, actually once, when the north pasture well ran dry, and once when the calf losses hit so bad that winter she'd had to sell her mother's brooch just to keep feed on the property. Franklin Whitmore had never told her the full amount. She'd known there was debt. She hadn't known the debt was a number that looked like the entire worth of Willow Ridge Ranch. Decker Hale's letter gave her 30 days. 30 days to produce the full payment transfer title or vacate the property. She read that last word, vacate, and felt something cold and final move through her chest. This was her father's land. His father's land before that. She'd been born in the bedroom at the back of the main house, delivered in the same bed where her grandmother died, in the same room where her father read the Bible aloud every Sunday morning until his voice gave out, and then after that just sat holding it, lips moving in silence. This land had her blood in the dirt. Literally, she still had the scar on her left palm from the summer she was 12, and fell through the barn floor and cut herself on a rusted nail. And her father sat with her for 3 hours pulling splinters and telling her that the ranch would always be hers. He never mentioned that he'd signed part of it away. She put the letter back in the envelope. She went outside. She stood on the porch and looked out at the flat summer gold of the pasture, the dry wind moving through the grass like something breathing. And she said out loud to no one, in a voice she barely recognized, "Not Decker Hale. Not him. Not ever." Then she went back inside and started thinking. She thought for 2 days. She thought through every option. She had lined them up like fence posts, tested each one for rot. Sell the livestock, not enough. The market was bad, and she'd lose a third of value in a forced sale. Find a loan from the bank in Cheyenne. She'd already tried that 8 months ago, when she saw the debt letters starting to stack up on her father's desk. The bank manager, a man named Grover Pitt, who wore a waistcoat 2 sizes too small and smelled of bay rum and condescension, had looked at her across his desk and explained slowly, and with the particular patience men used when they wanted you to know they thought you were stupid, that a single woman with no male cosigner on a property with existing liens was not a credit risk the bank was prepared to take. She had smiled at Grover Pitt with every muscle in her face and walked out without saying what she thought of him. Sell parcels. Decker Hale had anticipated this. His letter included a clause. Any partial sale of Willow Ridge acreage in the 30-day period would trigger immediate full debt acceleration. She'd checked it 3 times, certain she was misreading. She wasn't. He had planned this. He had planned this before her father was cold. Which left the 4th option. The one she'd been circling for 2 days like a dog circling a porcupine. She'd heard of Ethan Calloway the way you hear of weather through other people in the form of warning. He'd come to this part of Wyoming 4 years back, some said from Colorado, some said from further north. Nobody knew exactly. He'd bought 40 acres of ridgeland just east of the old Harmon property and built himself a cabin and a modest stable and a fence line that suggested clearly he did not intend to be neighborly. He ran cattle, a small herd well managed. He hired one hand, a quiet older man named Otto, and the two of them kept to themselves in a way the town of Bridger Creek found deeply suspicious. People talked about Ethan Calloway, the way small towns talk about any man who doesn't come to church and doesn't drink at the saloon and doesn't explain himself to anyone. They said he'd lost a wife. They said it was sickness. They said it was something worse. They said he'd been a different man before, and that whatever had happened had burned that man down to the frame and left something harder in his place. Caroline had seen him exactly twice before the morning she knocked on his door. The first time was at the Bridger Creek General Store 18 months ago. He'd been buying rope and axle grease and had stood at the counter with the rope coiled over one shoulder, waiting without impatience, while the clerk wrote out his total, and she'd noticed that he was the kind of man who took up physical space without seeming to try for it broad through the shoulders. Unhurried in every movement, his hat pulled low enough that she couldn't read his eyes, but could see the line of his jaw and the particular stillness of a man who has learned to hold himself very quiet in public places. The second time was at her father's funeral. He had stood at the back. He hadn't spoken to anyone. When the service ended and people moved toward the house for the reception, he had walked to the grave, stood there for a moment with his hat in both hands, and then walked back to his horse and ridden north without a word to anyone. She'd wondered about that. A man who barely knew Franklin Whitmore paying that kind of respect. Now she was standing on his porch, knocking on a door she had no business knocking on, with 30 days and a desperate plan and absolutely nothing else. The door opened and Ethan Calloway looked at her. He didn't say anything. He just looked. He was taller than she remembered. The morning light caught the dust on his shirt, the work-roughened line of his hands where he held the doorframe. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-brown that she would later think of as the color of winter creek water, not cold exactly, but not warm either. Clear, still, giving nothing away for free. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was low and even. "Your father passed last week. I'm sorry for it." "Thank you." She had practiced what she was going to say. She'd written it out actually on paper the night before and read it back to herself 3 times until it stopped sounding rehearsed. None of it came out the way she'd rehearsed it. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Something that has no good reason to it and no right, and I won't blame you one moment if you close this door." He didn't close it. He waited. She told him about the debt. She told him about Decker Hale's letter. She told him about the 30-day clock and the clause that prevented partial sale, and the fact that Grover Pitt at the Cheyenne Bank had looked at her like she was a child asking to borrow his best horse. She told him all of it standing on his porch in the July heat, without looking away from his face, because she'd decided on the ride over that the only thing she had left to offer was honesty, and she wasn't going to waste it by being ashamed. Then she said, "A man with a co-signed mortgage on a property with clear title has legal standing to apply for refinancing that a single woman does not. If we were married legally on paper, nothing more, I could walk into that bank as a wife with a co-signer and present the ranch as jointly held free and clear property. The debt was against my father's note, not against the deed itself. My father's lawyer, Mr. Ames, believes there's legal standing to renegotiate on a joint application." Ethan Calloway had not moved during any of this. "You want a paper marriage," he said. "I want to save my father's land." "Those aren't the same answer." "No," she said, "but the second one is the only true one." He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that made her want to fill the silence, and she refused to, because she'd learned from watching her father negotiate that the person who speaks first into silence almost always loses something. "I heard Decker Hale's been buying up ridge property," Ethan said finally. "He's been trying. He came at me twice, last fall, once in the spring." His jaw moved slightly. "I didn't sell." "I know. He won't stop at one ranch." "I know that too." He looked out past her toward the South Ridge, where you could just see the tree line of Willow Ridge property through the summer haze. His expression didn't change. But something shifted behind some small interior calculation she couldn't read. "What does Mr. Ames say about the legal timeline?" he asked. She told him. He nodded once slowly. "And after," he said, "when the refinancing goes through and the debt is settled, we file for dissolution, quietly through Ames's office. It's not uncommon. It won't be remarked on." "You've thought this through." For 2 days straight. He was quiet again. She watched him look at his land, the ridge, the sky, the dry summer grass moving in the hot wind, and she thought she understood something about Ethan Calloway in that moment that she hadn't understood before. He wasn't thinking about whether to say yes or no. He'd made that decision somewhere in the middle of her explanation. He was thinking about what came after. "I have conditions," he said. Her chest loosened by half an inch. "Name them." "I won't lie to people I respect. Ames will know the full arrangement from the start. Otto, my hand, will know." "I can accept that." "I won't have it become town gossip before it's done. You keep this between the necessary people." "Agreed." He looked at her directly. "And you make me one promise." "What promise?" "That you tell me the truth," he said. "Whatever happens, whatever changes. You don't manage me the way you'd manage a business transaction. You treat me like a person who made a choice to help you." She felt the weight of that. The particular weight of being asked to be honest by someone who had clearly been given a great deal less than honesty by life. "I promise," she said. He nodded, reached back inside the door, and took his hat off the hook. "Put it on." "I'll ride to Ames's office this afternoon," he said. "We can set it for Thursday if he has a judge available." "Thursday," she said. "Yes." He stepped past her onto the porch. She stepped aside to give him room. He stopped, looked at her from under the hat brim that still Creekwater gaze. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes." "This is a hard thing you're doing. Asking a stranger for something this large." He paused. "Your father was a man who kept his word. I don't imagine that was an accident." She didn't trust her voice all the way. "It wasn't," she managed. He walked to his horse. She watched him go. Thursday came faster than she was ready for. The Bridger Creek Courthouse was a 2-story wood frame building with a territorial flag that never quite sat right on its pole, always twisted, always fighting the wind. Judge Alderman was a man in his 60s with ink-stained fingers, and the look of someone who had seen too many human disasters to be surprised by any specific one. He read the marriage application, looked at Caroline, looked at Ethan, asked 3 standard questions, and stamped the paper with the efficient boredom of a man completing paperwork. That was it. No flowers, no witness tears, no music. Caroline Whitmore signed her name below Ethan Calloway's, and when she set the pen down, her hand was entirely steady, and she told herself that was good. On the courthouse steps, Ethan stood beside her, while the July sun hit the dust of the street, and the town of Bridger Creek moved around them in its ordinary way, men on horseback, women with baskets, a dog lying in the shade of the livery stable. Nobody was looking at them particularly. Nobody knew. "I'll move some of my things to Willow Ridge," he said. "For appearances. I'll stay in the hired hand room if that suits." "There's a room off the north end of the house," she said. "Private entrance. More appropriate." "That suits better." He adjusted his hat. "I won't be in your way." "You're not in my way." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction. "I'll be there by sundown," he said. He rode north. She stood on the courthouse steps until he was gone from sight, and then she sat down right there on the top step in her best dress and pressed her father's broken pocket watch against her sternum and breathed. She had 30 days to save the ranch. She had a husband she didn't know. And Decker Hale, somewhere in Cheyenne, didn't know yet that the board had shifted. He arrived at Willow Ridge at 6 in the evening as promised. Caroline had spent the afternoon cleaning the north room. It had been used for storage since the last hired hand quit 2 years back, dragging out feed sacks and broken harness and a rusted hay hook, scrubbing the floor, making up the cot with the best linens she had. She'd stood in the doorway when she was finished and looked at the bare clean room and thought, this is the strangest thing I have ever done. She was frying salt pork when she heard him ride in. She heard him put the horse in the barn, heard the bucket at the well, heard after a while his footsteps on the porch measured unhurried, and then a single knock at the kitchen door. She opened it. He had a saddlebag over one shoulder and his rifle in his right hand muzzle down. Behind him, the long Wyoming summer evening stretched gold and flat all the way to the ridge. "Room ready?" he asked. "Through the hall left door," she said. "There's a hook for your gear. Wash basin's been filled." "Thank you." He started past her and then stopped. "There's salt pork enough for two," she said, because she'd decided on this during the afternoon. "If you haven't eaten." He looked at the pan, looked at her. "I haven't," he said. "Then sit," she said. "First meal on this ranch, Mr. Calloway. Might as well start how we mean to go on." He set his gear by the door and hung his hat on the peg she indicated and sat down at the kitchen table. She put the plate in front of him and poured coffee and sat across from him, and they ate without a great deal of conversation, and it was strange, not uncomfortable. Strangely not uncomfortable, like two people who had known each other in some other life and were just now remembering the rhythms. At one point he said, "The pump on your south trough is losing pressure." She looked up. "I know. I haven't had time to fix it. I'll look at it tomorrow." She almost said, "You don't have to." She stopped herself. Because he was right, it needed fixing, and he could fix it, and saying "you don't have to" was just a way of keeping a wall between them that she'd already agreed not to keep. "Thank you," she said instead. He nodded. They finished eating. He washed his own plate without being asked, set it on the drying rack, picked up his gear from by the door. "Miss Whitmore," she turned from the sink. "You should probably call me Caroline, for appearances." Something moved briefly across his face. "Caroline," he said. "Good night." "Good night, Mr. Calloway." "Ethan," he said quietly, and walked down the hall to his room. She lay awake for a long time that night. The ranch was quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet since her father died. Not the heavy, empty quiet of loss, but something different. Something she couldn't name for several minutes, lying in the dark, listening to the summer insects outside her window and the distant sound of a coyote somewhere on the north ridge. Then she placed it. The quiet felt occupied, like the house was no longer hollow. She pressed the pocket watch against her palm in the dark and thought about what her father used to say about deals made in good faith, that they always cost you something you didn't expect, and that the cost was usually the part that mattered most. She didn't know yet what this deal was going to cost her. She fell asleep before she could figure it out. 3 miles south in the Cheyenne office of Decker Hale Acquisitions and Land Holdings, a letter arrived that evening, addressed to Mr. Hale personally. It contained one piece of information that Caroline Whitmore of Willow Ridge Ranch had been married that Thursday morning, and her husband was one Ethan Calloway of the North Ridge. Decker Hale read the letter twice, folded it, set it on his desk. Then he smiled. Not the charming kind, not the social kind. The other kind. The kind that meant he was already thinking 3 moves ahead, and none of those moves were good for anyone but himself. He picked up his pen and began to write. The pump was worse than Ethan let on at dinner. He found that out at first light when he walked the south pasture fence line, the way he always walked, any new land slowly with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes moving, and stopped at the south trough to test the handle. 3 pumps, and the pressure died entirely. The leather valve was cracked through, dried out from a summer of heat, and neglect, the kind of failure that happened when there was nobody left to notice small things breaking. He stood at that trough for a moment thinking. Then he went back to the barn, found the toolbox hanging on the east wall. Old, well organized, the tools of a man who'd kept things in order, and went to work. Caroline came out of the house at 7 with 2 cups of coffee and found him elbow deep in the pump, housing the cracked valve sitting on the ground beside him. She stopped. He looked up. "I found the spare parts kit in the toolbox," he said. "Your father kept it well stocked. She looked at the pieces laid out on the ground beside him. She recognized the order of them. Father had laid tools out that way. Everything in the sequence it would be needed, nothing wasted, nothing confused. He did, she said quietly. She set one of the cups on the top of the fence post where he could reach it. He nodded his thanks without stopping work. She stood there for a moment, watching his hands move through the repair with the confidence of someone who had done this particular job before and done it enough times that his hands knew the steps without asking his brain. Then she said, because she was a person who needed to understand the things happening on her own land, "Where did you learn to fix a pump like that?" He didn't look up. "Colorado. My father ran cattle south of Pueblo. We had 6 stock troughs, and one of them was always broken." "You grew up ranching." "I grew up working," he said. There was no bitterness in it, just fact. She drank her coffee and watched him finish the repair, and when the pump handle came up with full pressure on the first stroke and water came out clean and strong, she felt something she hadn't felt in 6 days, something small and stubborn and alive, like the first green thing pushing up after a hard frost. She didn't name it. She just carried it back to the house with her and started on breakfast. That was the first morning. By the third morning there was a rhythm. She didn't plan it. He didn't plan it. It just arrived the way rhythms do on working land, because the land has its own requirements, and 2 people moving through those requirements in the same space eventually find the same currents. He was up before her. She'd hear him at the well before light the creak and splash of it, then the sound of him moving toward the barn. By the time she had the stove going and coffee on, he'd have the horses fed and the morning check of the fence line done, and he'd come in through the kitchen door with the hat off before he stepped inside every time without being told the way a man does when he was raised to respect a woman's house. He didn't talk much over breakfast. She didn't push it. But she noticed things. She noticed that he ate everything she put in front of him and never once said it wasn't to his taste. Even the 2 mornings she burned the cornbread because she was distracted with the ledger books. She noticed that he always refilled her coffee before his own when he got up to top off his cup. She noticed that when she came out to the pasture to check on the cattle and found him already there, he didn't explain himself or offer to leave. He just shifted to give her room and kept working. Like her presence was natural and expected, and not something that needed commentary. Small things, ranch things, things that shouldn't have meant anything. She caught herself thinking about them anyway. On the 4th day, Otto arrived. Ethan's hired hand was a man somewhere between 60 and 70, with a face like old saddle leather, and eyes the color of faded denim that missed absolutely nothing. He arrived on a mule deliberately, she would learn, because Otto found horses vain and mules sensible, and tied up at the barn and walked to the house and knocked on the door with the specific knock of a man who has knocked on a great many doors in his life and has no anxiety about any of them. When Caroline opened it, he took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said. "Otto Birch. I work for Ethan." He paused. "I know the arrangement. He told me. I'm not here to make it complicated. I'm here because he needs an extra hand moving the ridge cattle down for the summer graze, and I figure while I'm at it, I can help with whatever needs doing here." She looked at this man, this calm-weathered, wholly honest man, and made a decision in about 4 seconds. "I have fence posts on the north line that need resetting," she said. "And the barn loft needs a new board on the east side before the hay goes up." Otto put his hat back on. "I'll start with the loft. Fence can wait on cooler hours." He walked to the barn without another word. She stood in the doorway watching him and thought Ethan Calloway picks his people the same way he keeps his tools. Carefully. For quality, not convenience. That thought stayed with her longer than it had any right to. The twist came on the 8th day, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. She was in town for supplies, flour lamp oil, salt. The ordinary commerce of keeping a ranch running when Margaret Hollis stopped her outside the general store. Margaret Hollis was the wife of the bank director, a woman with very good manners and very sharp instincts, the kind of woman who knew everything that moved through a small town, and knew it approximately 30 minutes before anyone else did. She was also, Caroline had always thought, essentially kind, beneath the social precision which was rarer than it should have been. Caroline. She touched her arm. I heard about your marriage. I wanted to say I think it was brave. Caroline kept her expression easy. Thank you, Margaret. Grover Pitt is furious, you know. A small, satisfied smile. He went to the land office Monday to check the filing, apparently, and came back looking like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. She lowered her voice slightly. And Decker Hale sent a man up from Cheyenne yesterday. He was asking questions around town about Ethan Calloway, his background, his finances, his past. The word landed like a stone in still water. His past, Caroline repeated. I thought you should know. Margaret's eyes were direct and careful. Whatever the arrangement is, and I won't pry, you should know that Decker Hale is not going to sit still. He's going to look for something to pull on. Caroline thanked her and walked to her wagon and sat on the bench for a moment before she picked up the reins. Decker Hale was looking into Ethan's past. She didn't know Ethan's past. She'd promised him honesty, and she'd meant it. But honesty goes both ways, and the truth was, she had asked this man to attach his name to her crisis without asking him what he was carrying of his own. She drove back to Willow Ridge with that sitting on her chest the whole way home. She found him in the barn working a new shoe onto the gray mare, the horse patient under his hands in the way horses are only patient with people they've decided to trust. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him work for a moment, and then said, Decker Hale sent a man to town yesterday, asking about you. Ethan didn't stop the work. His hands kept moving, but something in the set of his shoulders changed a very small tightening, like a man who heard exactly the news he'd been waiting for and didn't intend to pretend he was surprised. What kind of questions? He said. Background. Finances. She paused. Past. He set down the rasp, straightened, looked at her across the mare's back. I should have told you before Thursday, he said. You don't owe me your history. Maybe not. But you're the one who'll catch the shrapnel if he finds something useful. He came around the horse and stood in the center of the barn and looked at her with that steady creekwater gaze. My wife died 4 years ago. Clara. Fever, it went fast. 6 days from the first symptom. He said it without flinching, but she could see what the saying of it cost him, the way his jaw went just slightly tighter on her name, the single controlled breath before he continued. She was pregnant. 7 months. I lost them both. The barn was very quiet. I'm sorry, Caroline said. The words were inadequate. She said them anyway because silence would have been worse. There was some question at the time, Ethan said. About my conduct. I'd been gone on a cattle drive when she got sick. Someone decided that meant I'd abandoned her. The accusation didn't stick. The other men on the drive confirmed the dates, but it followed me. That's part of why I came north. He held her gaze. If Decker Hale's man digs far enough back, he'll find the accusation. He won't find the refutation unless he's looking for it. Caroline absorbed this. She thought about Decker Hale, reading an old accusation, and deciding what to do with it. She thought about the specific kind of man who would use another man's grief as a legal weapon. He'll use it, she said. He'll try to. Ethan's voice was flat and certain. The question is how. We should tell Ames, Caroline said, before Hale can bring it to him first. Ethan looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. Like a man who expected to have to argue for the sensible thing and found instead it was already decided. Tomorrow morning, he said. I'll ride ahead tonight, she said. So Ames has time to think before we get there. He nodded once, picked up the rasp, and went back to the mare. She was 3 steps out of the barn when he said quietly behind her, Caroline. She turned. Thank you, he said, for not making it something it isn't. She didn't answer immediately because she was thinking about what he meant by that, the grace of being told a hard thing and not filling it with pity or performance, or the particular cruelty of treating a man like his grief was his defining quality. You did the same for me, she said. Thursday on your porch, you let me say the hard thing without making me feel reduced by it. He held her gaze for one moment, then turned back to the horse. She walked to the house and sat at the desk and began to write to Ames. The ride to Cheyenne the next morning took 2 hours, and they rode it without much conversation, which he understood was not coldness on his part, but a particular quality of presence, the ability to be completely beside a person, without requiring the space between them to be filled with sound. She'd grown up with a father who had the same quality. She'd always thought it was rare. They rode side by side through the summer heat, with the Wyoming flat stretching on all sides, and the occasional hawk turning overhead. And once when her horse shied at a jackrabbit in the grass. Ethan's hand came out automatically and caught her bridle rein for the 2 seconds it took the horse to settle, and then released it without comment. She noticed. She did not comment either. She did. Silas Ames was a lawyer of the old school. Thin, precise, quick-eyed, with the habit of absolute stillness while someone was talking. A stillness so complete it occasionally made people think he wasn't listening, when in fact he was listening to things they hadn't said aloud yet. He read Caroline's letter, listened to Ethan's account of the Colorado situation, and then sat for a long moment with his fingertips pressed together. "He'll use it in one of 2 ways," Ames said. "Either he'll bring it to the judge overseeing the mortgage refinancing as a character challenge, trying to establish that Mr. Calloway is not a reliable cosigner, or he'll use it socially. Spread it through Bridger Creek until it poisons the community, standing you need to make this refinancing feel stable." "Which is he more likely to do?" Caroline asked. "Both," Ames said, "simultaneously. That's how Decker Hale operates. He doesn't pick one lever. He pushes all of them at once and sees which one gives first." He looked at Ethan. "I need you to get me the names and current whereabouts of every man on that cattle drive who can confirm your timeline." 3 of them, Ethan said. "I know where 2 of them are. The third I'd need to write north." "Right today?" Ames said. "I want affidavits before the end of the month." He turned to Caroline. "And you, I need the full accounting of your father's debt. Every payment he made, every letter he received from Hale's office, every piece of paper that touched this transaction." "I have them," she said. "The ledger books and the correspondence files. My father kept everything." "Good man," Ames said quietly. "Bring it to me by Thursday." They left his office and stood in the Cheyenne Street in the midday heat, and Ethan put his hat on and looked south toward the mountains, showing faint and blue at the edge of the sky. 2 weeks, he said. "That's what we've got before Hale moves." "Then we move first," she said. He looked at her. That almost smile again, the fractional thing at the corner of his mouth that she was learning to read as the equivalent in another man of a full grin. "Your father raised you right," he said. She felt something warm move through her chest that she told herself was simply the satisfaction of having a plan and a partner who could execute it. She told herself that firmly and specifically, and then changed the subject. "We should eat before we ride back," she said. "There's a decent place on Margin Street." "Lead on," he said. They had lunch at a corner table in a restaurant that smelled of coffee and roast beef, and it was the first time she'd been in a public place with him where they were visibly a married couple, visibly because the waitress addressed her as Mrs. Calloway, and Caroline answered to it without hesitating, which she hadn't known she could do until she did, and Ethan ordered plainly, and ate without pretension, and at one point asked her with what seemed like genuine curiosity how her father had first come to Willow Ridge, and she told him the story. The whole story, her grandfather's original claim and the drought years and the winter. Her father was 17 when he drove cattle alone for 3 weeks through a blizzard, because there was no one else, and made it home with every animal still living. Ethan listened to all of it. "He raised you to run that ranch," he said. "He raised me to love it," she said. "The running I figured out on my own." "That's the harder kind of knowledge," Ethan said. "The kind you figure out on your own, because you don't have any illusions about it." She looked at him across the table. "What do you love?" she asked. Not carefully. She didn't plan the question. It just came the way honest things come when you've been in someone's company long enough to stop performing for them. "About your land. What made you stay in Wyoming instead of going back south after Clara?" He was quiet for a moment. "The ridge," he said finally, "in the early morning, When it's still cold and the light hits the grass and everything's so still, it's almost loud. He turned his coffee cup on the table. Clara would have loved it. She never got to see it. But I stay because I think I'm finishing something she would have wanted finished. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes complete sense, Caroline said. He looked at her. She looked back. The waitress came to refill their coffee, and the moment broke into its ordinary pieces, and they finished the meal and rode back to Willow Ridge through the long afternoon, and nothing was said about the conversation in the restaurant. But something was different in the quality of the silence between them on the ride home. Not uncomfortable. Not formal. Something else. Something she didn't have a name for yet. They were half a mile from the ranch when they saw the rider. He was sitting his horse at the junction of the South Trail and the main road, a man Caroline didn't recognize, dressed too well for this country, on a horse that cost more than most hired hands made in 6 months. He wasn't moving. He was waiting. Ethan's whole body changed. She felt it without seeing it, the shift in his presence, the way a man goes from ordinary to alert, from neighbor to something more watchful and more dangerous when a threat declares itself. "Stay beside me," he said quietly. "Just that." She stayed beside him. As they rode up, the man on the expensive horse touched his hat brim. His smile was the smooth assembled kind, the kind that takes practice in a mirror. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "What a surprise. I was just coming to pay a friendly call." "Mr. Hale's man, I imagine," Ethan said. His voice was perfectly level. The kind of level that's not calm, it's control. Different thing entirely. The man's smile didn't move. "Carter Webb, Mr. Hale's associate. He wanted me to extend his personal congratulations on the marriage." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "And to deliver this." Caroline took the envelope because she would not give this man the satisfaction of refusing it. "He's also asked me to inquire," Webb said, "whether you've had any further thoughts about the property situation. He's prepared to offer very favorable terms for a transfer of the eastern parcels. Just the eastern parcels, quite generous given the current debt situation." "The debt situation is being managed," Caroline said. Of course. Webb's eyes moved to Ethan, moved over him the way a man's eyes move over something he's been told to evaluate. "Mr. Calloway, I believe you spent some time down in Colorado before coming north. Pueblo area, was it?" Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "It was," he said. "Mr. Hale has some associates in that area. He's been doing his due diligence as a concerned neighbor." Webb's tone was smooth as river clay. "Wanted to make sure all parties in this situation are above reproach." The threat was there, dressed in social language, smiling at them from a good horse. Caroline felt the anger move through her like heat from a fire, sudden and complete and entirely clear. She did not show it on her face. She'd learned from her father that anger shown to a man like this was ammunition given freely. "Tell Mr. Hale," she said, "that we appreciate his concern for his neighbors, and that Willow Ridge is managed by people of excellent repute and will continue to be. We'll wish him well." She touched her horse forward. Ethan held a beat longer. Just a beat. He looked at Webb with that creek-water gaze, the one that gave nothing, and took everything in, and then he turned and rode after her. They didn't speak until the ranch was in sight. Then Ethan said, "He's moving faster than we thought." "He is," she said. "Ames needs to file before the end of the week. Whatever he's preparing, it needs to be filed first." "I'll ride to send a wire tonight." "Caroline." She turned in the saddle. His eyes were steady on her. "Hale's going to make this personal. It's already personal for him. That means it's going to get harder before it gets easier." "I know," she said. "Do you?" She held his gaze. "My father kept every piece of paper that man ever sent. Every letter. Every notice. 3 years of documentation." She paused. "Decker Hale has been planning this since before my father died. I've been planning this since the morning I read his letter. The difference between us is that he thinks I have nothing left to fight with." She turned back toward the ranch. "He's wrong about that." Ethan rode beside her. After a moment he said, Yes, he is. That was all. But the way he said it, the weight he put into two words, the absence of any qualifier settled something in her chest that had been unsettled since Thursday morning. She didn't examine it too closely. There was too much work to do. Back at the house, she went to the desk and opened her father's correspondence file and began pulling the Hale letters, every one in order, going back 3 years. She worked at it with the lamp burning and the summer evening moving toward dark outside the window, and at some point, she heard Ethan come in through the hall, stop at the study doorway, look at what she was doing. "Do you need help sorting them?" he asked. She looked at the stack. There were more than she'd realized when she last counted. "Yes," she said. He came in and sat across from her, and she handed him the stack of envelopes, and he began to open them and read them, and set them into piles by date, without asking for instructions, because he understood systems, and within an hour, they had 3 years of Decker Hale's intentions laid out in order on the study desk. And what those letters told Reed in sequence, without the softening that reading each one alone had provided, was a story that made her father's hands curl into fists at his desk, and made her want to put her hand through the window, and made Ethan go very, very still across from her, with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger. Something older than anger. Recognition. "He's done this before," Ethan said. "This exact sequence. The small loans through local agents, the debt consolidation play the accelerator clause on partial sales." He looked up from the letter in his hand. "He's done this to at least 3 other properties in this territory, and he's gotten away with it every time." "How do you know that?" she said. "Because this isn't a plan," Ethan said. "This is a script, and someone who's running a script has run it before." He set the letter down, looked at her. "We need to find the other properties," he said. "The ones he's already taken. If there's a pattern, if we can show Ames a pattern that's not just a defense anymore." She stared at him. "That's a case," she said. "That's a case," he said. The lamp burned between them, and the letters were spread out on the desk, and outside, the Wyoming night was pressing down on the summer plain, and for the first time since she'd read Decker Hale's envelope at the kitchen table, Caroline Whitmore did not feel like a woman on defense. She felt like a woman who had just seen the shape of the fight ahead of her and understood suddenly and with complete clarity that she was not in it alone. The pocket watch was still broken, but the hands didn't feel frozen anymore. Ames sent a wire back by 9 the next morning. 3 words. File by Friday. Ethan read it over Caroline's shoulder at the kitchen table and set his coffee down and said, "Then we have 4 days." 3, she said. "If we want Ames to have time to prepare the full brief before he walks into that office." He looked at her. 3, he agreed. They divided the work without discussing how. Caroline took the correspondence files, all 3 years of Hale's letters, and began writing a chronological summary for Ames, the kind of document that laid out a predatory pattern so clearly that even a judge who'd been bought couldn't pretend not to see it. Ethan rode north to his Ridge property and came back 2 hours later with a name, a rancher in the Powder River country named Samuel Greer, who had lost his spread to a debt consolidation scheme 2 years back. The details Ethan laid out matched Hale's script so closely it made Caroline stop writing and sit very still for a moment. "How did you know about Greer?" she asked. "Otto told me," Ethan said. "The winter I came north. He said there was a land broker out of Cheyenne who'd been working the territory for years, and that a man should watch his deed carefully if that broker ever smiled at him." He paused. "Otto doesn't warn people lightly. Can Greer testify?" "I wrote him this morning. We'll know in a week." "We may not have a week." "No," he said. "But we use what we have, and we build while we're using it." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man she'd known for 11 days, sitting in her father's chair, working her father's problem with the same methodical seriousness her father had brought to every hard thing, and felt something she didn't examine too carefully because there was too much work to do. and examining it would cost her focus she couldn't afford to spend. She turned back to the summary. He went back to his list of names. They worked until midnight. The fire started 3 days later. It began in the late afternoon in the worst possible hour when the summer heat had built all day and the wind had shifted west and the grass was dry enough to light from a spark carried a quarter mile. Caroline was in the barn checking on a cow that had been favoring her left front leg since morning, running her hand down the leg feeling for heat when she smelled it. Not smoke. Not yet. Something before smoke, the particular sharpening of the air that comes just before a fire, announces itself like the world drawing a breath. She came out of the barn and looked west. The grass line was moving wrong. For 1 second, she stood absolutely still, because her mind needed that second to accept what her eyes were telling it. Then she moved. She grabbed the wet burlap feed sacks from the barrel by the barn door. Her father had kept them there. Always kept them there for exactly this reason, soaked and ready, and she ran. She should have rung the bell first. She knew that. The bell on the south post was there, specifically to call for help. But the fire was moving toward the section of fence where the cattle were bunched in the afternoon heat. And she did the math in 1 second and decided the cattle came first and the bell came after. She was wrong about how fast it was moving. By the time she hit the west pasture, the fire had jumped the dry creek bed and was pushing hard across the grass in a rolling wall of orange and black, and the smoke was already thick enough to make her eyes run. She got 2 fence sections beat back before the wind shifted again, the cruel, indifferent shift that fire uses, and suddenly she was on the wrong side of it, the smoke between her and the barn, the heat pressing her back toward the east fence line. She wasn't panicking. She was thinking hard and fast-running options. The east fence. She could go over it circle south. The cattle were already moving on their own, which was good. She just needed to get herself clear. Then she heard the boots. Not her boots. Heavier. Longer stride. Ethan came through the smoke like he'd walked through smoke before and knew exactly how to do it. Low, fast, the wet canvas he'd grabbed from somewhere already in his hands. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask where she was hurt, or whether she was all right, or any of the things people say when they're responding to their own fear, rather than to the actual situation. He just looked at her, looked at the fire, looked at the fence line and said, "East gate, 40 yards, go." She went. He went behind her, beating back the grass fire with the wet canvas in hard, efficient strokes, cutting a path, the way a man cuts trail through brush, not fighting the whole thing, just opening enough to move through. She hit the east gate and got it open, and he came through behind her and pulled it shut. And then they were on the outside of the fire, and the cattle were moving south on their own. And the main house was safe, and the barn was safe, and the fire was eating the west pasture. But the west pasture was the one she could afford to lose. She stood at the east gate and coughed. Her eyes were streaming. Her hands were shaking not from fear, she told herself, from the physical effort, from the adrenaline of moving that fast through that kind of heat. Ethan stood beside her. He was breathing hard. A burn mark on the left forearm of his shirt, where the canvas hadn't covered. He was looking at the fire, tracking it, calculating the way a man does when he's been in dangerous situations before, and his brain has learned to stay operational when everything else is shouting. "It'll burn itself out at the rock line," he said. 2 hours. "The west pasture," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Can be reseeded," he said. "Come September." She knew that. She knew that. But knowing a thing and feeling it are 2 different processes, and right now she was watching a piece of her father's land burn, and there was nothing left to do about it, and the distance between knowing and feeling was about 100 miles wide. Her hands were still shaking. Ethan turned from the fire. He looked at her hands, not at her face, at her hands, because he was a man who read the honest information, and hands were always more honest than faces. And without a word, without any preamble or announcement of what he was doing, he put his hand over both of hers. Just that. His hand was large and work-rough and very warm, and it covered her shaking hands completely. And the weight of it, the simple human weight of another person's hand, did something that all her practical thinking and all her planning and all her determination had not been able to do in 11 days. It stopped the shaking. She stood at the east gate with the fire burning in the west pasture, and Ethan Calloway's hand over hers, and she breathed slowly all the way in and all the way out, and something wound unbearably tight in her chest since the morning she read Decker Hale's letter came loose by one crucial degree. "You don't fight this land alone," he said, quietly, not looking at her, looking at the fire, watching it, keeping track of it. "Not anymore." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. After a while, the shaking was entirely gone, and he moved his hand, and they stood apart again, watching the fire work its way toward the rock line, exactly as he'd said it would. And the silence between them was the kind of silence that happens after something real has occurred. Not uncomfortable, not formal, but changed. The way air changes after lightning. The same air, different charge. Otto arrived 40 minutes later, riding hard from the North Ridge, and took one look at the west pasture and then one look at the two of them and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent response he could have given. He went to check the cattle. Ethan went to check the barn. Caroline stood at the east gate until the fire hit the rocks and died. Then she walked to the well, drew water, washed her face and hands, and went inside to make dinner because the ranch still needed feeding and the day wasn't done because something hard had happened in it. That was the thing about working land. It didn't wait for you to finish feeling. She was at the stove when Ethan came in through the kitchen door and stopped. "Burn on your left hand," he said. She looked down. She hadn't noticed. A strip across the palm where she'd gripped the burlap too hard, and the heat had gotten through. "It's nothing," she said. "Sit down," he said. "Ethan." "Sit down, Caroline." The way he said it, not loud, not commanding, just completely certain, made her sit. He went to the shelf where she kept the medical tin, found the salve and the clean cloth, and sat across from her and took her left hand in his and examined the burn with the same careful attention he gave to everything he decided deserved care. "It's not bad," he said, "but it needs wrapping." "I've had worse," she said. "That doesn't make this one not worth treating." She watched his hands work the salve, applied with 2 fingers even, and thorough, the cloth wrapped from wrist to knuckle with the precise efficiency of someone who'd done field medicine before and didn't find it dramatic. His head was bent over her hand, and she could see the dust in his hair from the afternoon's work and the slight tension still in his jaw from the fire, the last remnant of the hyper-alertness that hadn't entirely stood down. "The burn on your arm," she said. He glanced at his left sleeve. "It didn't get through." "Let me see." "It's fine." "Ethan?" She said it the same way he'd said her name, just certain. He looked up, and then that fractional almost smile, barely a thing gone almost before it arrived. He pushed the sleeve up. The burn was superficial, reddened, but not broken. She got up and got the salve herself, and sat back down and applied it without asking permission, and he held his arm still and let her. And they sat at the kitchen table in the quiet after the fire with the light going outside, and tended each other's burns in the particular intimate practicality of 2 people who have been through something together and come out the other side. "Thank you," she said, "for coming through the smoke." "You would have found your way clear," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but it was faster with you there." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it was." She didn't know why those 4 words felt like more than the situation required. She moved on before she could examine it. "The west pasture," she said. "We can survey the damage tomorrow morning. If the root system survived, we may not need full reseeding, just patchy restoration on the worst sections." "That's what I was thinking," he said. "And the filing with Ames, it still goes Thursday. The fire doesn't change that." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She put the salve away and tied off the cloth on her hand and stood up to go back to the stove. He rolled his sleeve back down. Outside, the last of the summer light was leaving, and the first stars were showing, and somewhere on the North Ridge a coyote was calling the same coyote or a different one, she could never tell. "Ethan," she said with her back to him at the stove. "Yes." "Why did you come through the smoke?" She paused. "You could have gone for the bell, called for help. That would have been the logical thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw you run toward it." he said. You didn't hesitate. You just ran toward it. Another pause. I wasn't going to hesitate either. She stood at the stove and felt that settle somewhere behind her sternum and did not say anything else about it. She served dinner, and they ate, and it was different from the other dinners. Quieter in a way that was warmer, not colder. The quiet of two people who no longer needed to manage the space between them, because the space had changed into something neither of them had fully named. The twist came the next morning. She was sorting through the damage assessment on the west pasture on paper with the plot map from her father's files, marking the worst sections when she heard a horse come into the yard. She looked out the window. A man she didn't know. Good horse. Territorial marshal's badge on his vest catching the morning light. She went to the door. The marshal was in his 40s, lean with the look of a man who rode long distances and thought carefully. He took his hat off when she opened the door. Mrs. Calloway, name's Marshal Deacon Hurst, Territorial Circuit. I need to speak with your husband, ma'am, if he's available. Her heart moved sideways in her chest. She kept her face composed. What about? She asked. It's a legal matter. I'd prefer to discuss it with both of you if that's agreeable. She found Ethan in his barn. She said quietly close, Marshal, Territorial Circuit. He wants to speak with us both. Ethan's face went absolutely still. Then he set down the harness he was working and walked to the house with her. Marshal Hurst was standing in the kitchen. He'd accepted the offer of a chair, but hadn't relaxed into it a man on official business, sitting the way official business requires. He looked at Ethan when he walked in with the particular attention of someone doing evaluation. Mr. Calloway, he said. Marshal, Ethan said. He pulled out a chair and sat across from him. He did not look worried. He looked like a man who'd been expecting a knock on the door and had decided in advance how he was going to answer it. I'll be direct, Hurst said. I've received a formal complaint from a Mr. Decker Hale of Cheyenne alleging that the marriage filed in Bridger Creek Courthouse on Thursday last was conducted under fraudulent pretenses for the purpose of interfering with a legitimate debt collection proceeding. The kitchen went very quiet. Caroline sat down. Her voice came out entirely level. That's a serious accusation. It is? Hurst agreed. Which is why I'm here to conduct an inquiry rather than act on it directly. Mr. Hale provided documentation. He set a folder on the table. He's asserting the marriage was arranged solely for financial advantage, and that it does not constitute a legal union under territorial law. On what basis? Ethan said. His voice was the same level it always was, the complete control level. Witnesses, Hurst said. He has two individuals prepared to testify that they were told directly by unnamed parties that the marriage was a business arrangement only. Carolyn felt the cold move through her. Unnamed parties. That meant someone who knew. Someone who had been told. She thought immediately of Otto, then dismissed it. Otto was not a man who talked. Then she thought of Margaret Hollis, who had been kind and careful and discreet. Then she thought of Silas Ames, who was a lawyer and spoke to no one about his client's business. Then she thought of someone else. She thought of Grover Pitt, the bank manager who had turned her down 8 months ago and had, according to Margaret Hollis, gone to the land office Monday when news of the marriage reached him. Grover Pitt, who was small and resentful, and had connections to Decker Hale's financial network that she had not thought about until this exact moment. She had told Pitt 8 months ago that she would find another way. She had not told him what that way would be. But Pitt moved in circles, and circles talked, and if any whisper of the arrangement had moved through those circles, Marshal Hurst, she said. What would satisfy your inquiry? Hurst looked at her with the direct measuring gaze of a man who had been doing this work long enough to know the difference between a person lying and a person telling the truth. A thorough accounting of the relationship, how you met the circumstances of the marriage, whether it is genuine. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes on the marshal, steady and unhurried. My wife's father died 2 weeks ago, he said. I have known the Whitmore family for 2 years. I've been on this ranch every third day for the past week because that's what the situation needed. I fixed the south trough pump the morning after I moved in. I pulled her out of a grass fire 2 days ago. He paused. If Mr. Hale has witnesses who want to characterize this marriage, I'd like to hear from them directly. Because what they're characterizing is my wife and my home, and I don't accept that kind of characterization from second-hand sources. Shifted in Marshall Hurst's face. Not a lot. Just enough. I'll need to speak with the attorney of record, he said. Silas Ames, Cheyenne. Caroline had her voice entirely under control. He'll be available tomorrow morning. I can wire him today. Do that, Hurst said. He closed the folder. Stood. Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Calloway. He put his hat on. I'll be in Bridger Creek through Saturday. I expect I'll be hearing from Mr. Ames. He left. The kitchen was very quiet. Caroline looked at Ethan across the table. He was looking at the door the marshal had walked out of. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. Grover Pitt, she said. He turned to her. I think Pitt talked, she said. I don't know exactly what he said or who he said it to, but he's the only one with the connections and the motive. He's been angry since I went around him. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Can Ames work with this? Ames has worked with worse, she said. But Ethan, she stopped. Say it, he said. The marshal is going to ask Ames whether this is a genuine marriage, and Ames is going to have to answer that question as our attorney, which means he's going to have to characterize it in terms that hold up legally. She looked at him steadily. That's going to be harder to do if everything we've told him is that it isn't. The weight of that sat between them. Ethan looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked at her. What are you saying? He asked. I'm saying that the line between what this started as and what it currently is, she said carefully, has gotten harder to locate than it was 2 weeks ago. And I don't know what to do with that. But I think you should know that I've noticed it. The kitchen was very still. The summer morning was pressing against the windows. Outside somewhere, Otto was working the fence line, and you could hear the distant ring of a hammer on a post. Ethan held her gaze for a long time. I've noticed it too, he said. He said it quietly without drama, without anything added to soften it or take it back. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, with the full weight of a man who meant exactly what he said and would not unsay it. Caroline breathed. I'm going to wire Ames, she said. Yes, he said. She got up. She was at the hall doorway when he said, Caroline. She turned. When Ames asks him if Hurst asks him whether this is a genuine marriage, he paused. Something moved through his face, something she hadn't seen before, something that cracked the composure slightly and showed what was underneath it, which was not cold and was not careful and was not distant at all. He won't be wrong to say yes. She stood in the doorway. No, she said. He won't. She went to send the wire. Ames arrived the next morning on the early stage from Cheyenne, which told her that the wire had alarmed him enough to come in person rather than send a letter. He walked into the Willow Ridge kitchen with his case and his hat and his particular focused stillness and sat down and listened to everything: the marshal's visit, Hurst's inquiry, the 2 unnamed witnesses, Grover Pitt, without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Hale moved faster than I anticipated. He filed the fraud complaint the same day Carter Webb visited you. That means he already had the witnesses lined up before Webb came here. This wasn't a reaction to seeing you fight back. He planned this before he sent Webb. He wanted us to know he was moving, Ethan said. Webb's visit was the announcement. Yes. Ames looked at him. He wanted to see how you'd respond under pressure. Whether you'd make a mistake. He paused. You didn't. The statement you gave Marshal Hurst was correct. I would have advised exactly what you said. Can we fight the fraud complaint? Caroline asked. We can do better than fight it, Ames said. We can make Hale wish he'd never filed it. He opened his case and produced a sheaf of papers. The affidavits I requested from Colorado came in yesterday. 3 witnesses to Ethan's timeline. I also had a researcher review territorial land records, and I found what you suspected: Hales used this exact structure on 4 properties in the past 6 years. 2 of them I can document comprehensively. He laid the papers on the table. If Hale wants to take this to a territorial inquiry, I will welcome that. Because a territorial inquiry requires full disclosure of all parties' conduct. And his conduct laid out across 6 years and 5 properties is going to be very interesting to the right federal ears. Caroline looked at the papers on the table. She thought of her father sitting at this table writing those letters, keeping those records, not knowing why it mattered to be so careful, but being careful anyway, because that was who he was. He kept everything, she said. My father. Every letter Hale ever sent him. I know, Ames said. He looked at the stack of correspondence already sorted on the side of the table. That's going to matter more than he knew. She put her hand flat on the stack of her father's papers. All that careful keeping, all those years of documentation that must have felt like futile record-keeping at the time, and felt something move through her chest that was grief and gratitude wound so tightly together she couldn't separate them. Then Ethan's hand came down beside hers on the papers, not on top of hers, just beside, close enough to touch if either of them moved an inch. Neither of them moved, but neither of them moved away either. Ames across the table looked down at his own papers with the focused discretion of a man who had just seen something he wasn't going to comment on. There's one more thing, he said. Hale's fraud complaint, if we take it to a full territorial hearing, I need both of you prepared to testify, together, in public. He looked at each of them. Whatever questions come about the nature of this marriage, you'll need to answer them honestly and completely, in front of whatever judge Hale manages to assemble. We'll answer them, Ethan said. Together, Caroline said. Ames looked at them for a moment. Then he nodded once in the way of a man who has just confirmed a thing he'd already suspected. Good, he said. Then let's talk about how we take Decker Hale apart. Ames left that afternoon with the full correspondence file under his arm and a look on his face that Caroline had learned to read as controlled fury dressed in professional clothing. She stood on the porch and watched the stage dust settle after he was gone, and thought about what he'd said at the end, that Hale's fraud complaint, if taken to a full territorial hearing, would require disclosure from both sides. All parties. All conduct. 6 years of Decker Hale's acquisitions, laid open in a federal record for anyone with eyes and jurisdiction to read. Hale had filed that complaint thinking it would scare them into settlement. He had handed them the lever they needed to move the entire weight of what he'd built. She turned from the porch and went back inside and found Ethan at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil writing names. The other ranchers, he said without looking up. The ones Hale took. Ames identified 4 properties. I know where 2 of those families ended up. Otto told me 2 winters back. If those people are willing to come forward as witnesses, they'd have to trust that Ames can actually finish this, she said. Yes. Can he? Ethan set the pencil down and looked at her. Ames is the best territorial attorney I've ever seen work, and right now he's angry. I've never seen him angry before today. He paused. An angry Silas Ames is something Decker Hale has not encountered yet. She almost smiled. Then we find the families. Otto can ride to the Greer place tomorrow. He knows Greer personally. They'll talk to him before they talk to anyone else. And the second family. Connors. Lost their spread on the Eastern Range 18 months ago. I can write today. With the affidavits Ames already has from Colorado, plus Greer's testimony, plus Connors. That's a pattern even a bought judge can't ignore. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Hale's going to know we're building this. Webb will be watching. Let him watch, Ethan said. The faster we build it, the less time he has to dismantle it. She looked at the list of names on his paper. She picked up the pencil and added 2 more neighboring ranchers who had mentioned in passing over the past year receiving visits from land brokers out of Cheyenne. She hadn't connected those visits to Hale at the time. She connected them now. These 2, she said. They may have documentation of their own. Ethan looked at the names, nodded. I'll ride to them myself. When? Tomorrow, early. She looked at his face, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of hesitation, and thought about the fact that this man had walked into her crisis with nothing to gain, and had proceeded to treat it as his own without once making her feel the debt of that. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "This is more than you signed on for." He held her gaze for a moment. "Is it?" She didn't have an answer for, or rather, she had one, but it was the kind of answer that changed things, and she wasn't ready to change things in the middle of a fight. "Go ride tomorrow," she said. "I'll handle the correspondence." He picked up the pencil. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the almost smile, gone before it fully arrived. She went to the desk and began to write. Otto left for the Greer property before sunup the next morning, and Ethan rode south toward the neighboring ranches, and Caroline was alone at Willow Ridge for the first time in 2 weeks, and the aloneness felt different than it had before. Not empty, just temporarily unoccupied. The way a room feels different when you know the person who usually sits in it is coming back. She was sorting through the last of her father's files, the oldest ones from before the Hale correspondence began, when she found the letter. It was at the bottom of the third box, folded twice, and it was not from Decker Hale. It was from her father to her mother, written 22 years ago, before Caroline was born, in the first winter on Willow Ridge, when the cattle losses were so bad, her father had nearly walked away from the whole thing. She sat on the floor of the study and read it. Her father had written, "I don't know if this land is worth what it costs, but I know that walking away from hard things has never made me a man I wanted to be. So I'll stay another winter and see what spring looks like. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Stay one more season and see." She folded the letter back up. She put it in her pocket. She went back to work. The first rider arrived 2 hours later. Not Ethan, not Otto, a man she didn't know, young, nervous, riding a horse hard enough that the animal was lathered. He pulled up at the gate and called out, and she came to the porch, and he said from the gate, not coming closer, "Message for Mrs. Calloway. From Mr. Hale's office, ma'am. Urgent." She walked to the gate, took the envelope. The young man didn't wait. He turned his horse and left fast, like someone who didn't want to be associated with what he was delivering. She opened it on the porch. It was short, 3 paragraphs. Decker Hale's language smooth, reasonable, poisonous. The first paragraph expressed his personal regret that legal proceedings had become necessary. The second outlined in very precise terms the scope of the fraud complaint he'd filed, and what a full territorial inquiry would mean for both Caroline and Ethan, the time, the cost, the public exposure, the particular damage to Ethan's reputation given the historical allegations from Colorado. The third paragraph offered an alternative. A private settlement. Transfer of the eastern 40 acres of Willow Ridge property to Hale Acquisitions at assessed value plus full debt retirement from Hale's personal holding company at 0 interest. All legal proceedings withdrawn. All allegations retracted. No public record. She read it twice. Then she went inside and put it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it. It was a better offer than she expected. That was the thing that frightened her. Because a man like Hale didn't make better offers out of generosity, he made them when he was afraid. And if Hale was afraid of what Ames was building, that meant Ames was building something real. But the eastern 40 acres was the best pasture land on the property, her father's finest section, the land she'd learned to ride on, the land where her mother was buried. She was still standing at the table when she heard boots on the porch. Ethan came through the door. He looked at her face. He looked at the letter on the table. He crossed the kitchen and picked it up and read it without asking. When he put it down, his jaw was tight. "The Eastern 40, she said. "I saw your mother's grave marker on that section," he said, quietly. "The day I first walked the property line." "Yes." He looked at the letter. "He knows that too, I imagine. He does his research." "He does." She pulled out a chair and sat. "It's a real offer. That's what he's counting on. The fact that it's real enough to consider." "Are you considering it?" She looked up at him. 2 weeks ago I might have. Before Ames showed us what Hale's done to 5 other families." She paused. "If I take this settlement, he moves on to the next ranch, and the one after that. And those families don't have a Silas Ames with a 6-year paper trail." Ethan stood at the table and said nothing. "I know that's not—" She started. "No," he said. "You're right. You're completely right." He turned the letter face down on the table. "We send it to Ames today. He'll want to use it," she said, "as evidence of consciousness of guilt." "Good," Ethan said. "Let him." She wrote the wire to Ames, while Ethan unsaddled his horse and told her what he'd found at the neighboring ranches. Both families had documentation of Hale's broker visits, and one of them, a man named Aldrich, who ran a modest cattle operation east of Bridger Creek, had a letter in which Hale's representative made explicit statements about debt consolidation terms that, according to Ames's earlier briefing, were legally inconsistent with what Hale had then filed in the county land records. "That's misrepresentation," Caroline said. "On paper, signed." "Aldrich kept the letter because he thought it smelled wrong at the time," Ethan said. "He said he didn't know what to do with it." "He does now," she said. "He'll testify. He was very clear about that." A brief pause. "He's angry. He said 3 of his neighbors have lost land in the past 4 years, and he spent that whole time wondering if he was next." She thought about that. All those families. All that quiet, isolated fear, each one thinking they were alone in it. None of them knowing the others were carrying the same weight, all of them on the same predator's list. That was how Hale worked. He kept them separated. Kept them from comparing notes. Kept each one thinking their situation was unique and personal and private. "He's been counting on people not talking to each other," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "So we make sure they do." That afternoon, she sent 4 letters to the Greer family, to the Connors family, to Aldrich, and to a 4th rancher Ethan had identified through Otto's network, whose property bordered Hale's earliest acquisition in the territory. She wrote each letter plainly and without legal language, just woman to family. "I know what happened to your land. I know you're not alone. We are building something that may give you your record back, if not your property. We need your story. Please write to Silas Ames in Cheyenne." She sealed the 4th envelope and looked at the stack. "My father would have done this sooner," she said, "if he'd known." Ethan was at the window. He turned. "Your father kept 3 years of documentation on a man he had no legal training to fight. He kept it anyway, not knowing if it would ever matter." He paused. "That's how you fight something you don't know how to fight yet. You keep the record. You trust that the record will find a purpose." She looked at him. "You sound like you've thought about this before," she said. Something moved across his face. "Clara's father lost a mining claim to a fraudulent assay report," he said, "before I met her. He couldn't prove it. He had no record." He was quiet for a moment. "He died knowing the man who took it never answered for it. I think about that sometimes." She held his gaze. "This one will answer for it." "Yes," he said. "He will." The hearing date came in from Ames's office on a Tuesday, 12 days after the fraud complaint was filed. 3rd week of August. Federal Circuit Judge, not a territorial appointment. A federal one, which meant Hale's network of local judicial influence was significantly less useful than he'd built it to be. Ames's wire was 3 lines, and the last line read, "He made a mistake going federal. We won't." Ethan read the wire and handed it back to her and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We have 2 weeks." 2 weeks, she agreed. "Then we need to talk about what happens after," he said. The kitchen went quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind of quiet. The kind that happens when something real is about to be said, and both people can feel it coming, and neither one of them is running from it. "After the hearing," she said carefully. "After the hearing." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, the way he sat across from her when they were working through the ledger or the letter's direct deliberate present. "We discussed a dissolution. When this is settled through Ames's office, that was the arrangement." "It was," she said. "Is that still what you want?" She looked at him, at this man who had come through smoke to find her, who had put his hand over her shaking hands at the east gate and said, "You don't fight this land alone." Who sat across from her every evening with his coffee and his unhurried presence, and made the house feel for the first time in 6 weeks like a place where someone lived, rather than a place where something had died. "Is it what you want?" she said. He held her gaze with that creek water steadiness that she'd stopped reading as coldness approximately 9 days ago. "I asked you first," he said. She almost laughed. The unexpectedness of it, the slight dry humor of it from a man who used humor so rarely that when it appeared it landed like a gift, made something loosen in her chest completely. "No," she said. "It's not what I want." He held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he said. "It's not what I want either." She breathed. Outside, the summer afternoon was moving toward evening in the long, slow way of Wyoming summers, the light going gold, and then amber, the first cool edge coming in from the mountains. "We should talk to Ames," she said, "about amending the terms." "After the hearing," he said. "After the hearing," she agreed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture as the East Gate, but different now, not comfort exactly, not rescue, just presence, and held it for a moment. Then he took his hand back and stood up and went to the stove to put the coffee on, and she turned back to the files and the kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of the evening. And it was nothing like what it had been 3 weeks ago, and everything like what she had stopped letting herself hope it could be. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that Decker Hale had received the rejection of his settlement offer that afternoon, and he did not take it as a man who accepted defeat. He took it as a man who had one more move. The move came 3 days before the hearing. It came in the form of a man named Harlan Price. Price arrived in Bridger Creek on a Wednesday and went directly to the saloon and spent the evening buying drinks for anyone who'd take them, and talking, in the easy, general, friendly way of a man who seems to have no particular agenda, which is always the most dangerous kind of talking. Otto heard about it Thursday morning from the livery owner, and rode to Willow Ridge and told Ethan directly without going to the house first because he understood that some information needed to reach Ethan before it reached Caroline. She found them in the barn. She could tell from the way they were standing Ethan with his arms crossed and a particular set to his jaw. Otto with his hat in his hands and his eyes serious that what Otto was saying was not good. She walked in. They both looked at her. "Tell me," she said. Otto told her. Price's story. The one he was telling at the saloon. The one that was moving through Bridger Creek, with the speed that bad stories always move through small towns, was this: that he had worked with Ethan Calloway in Colorado 4 years back, and that he could speak to the character of the man, and that the character was not what it appeared, and that the marriage in question was exactly what the fraud complaint said. It was arranged for money, and that Ethan Calloway was the kind of man who arranged such things. He did not say Clara's name. He didn't have to. Everyone in Bridger Creek who knew anything about Ethan's history knew enough to fill in the gaps with their own assumptions, and assumptions in small towns always grew darker than the original facts. Caroline stood in the barn and listened to all of this with her face entirely still. Then she said, "Did you ever work with a man named Harlan Price?" Ethan's jaw was tight. Briefly, one drive. He was let go before the drive ended for shorting the cattle count. He paused. He blamed me for reporting it. "He's Hale's man," she said. It wasn't a question. "Has to be," Otto said. "He's got no other reason to be in Bridger Creek." She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Where is he now?" "Still at the saloon, far as I know," Otto said. "He's been there since last night." "Is Marshal Hurst still in town?" Otto looked surprised by the question. "Through Saturday," he said. "Good." She turned to Ethan. "I want to go to town." "Caroline." "Hurst is conducting an inquiry into our marriage," she said. "He needs to know that Hale has placed a paid witness in Bridger Creek 3 days before a federal hearing. That's not just personal. That's interference with a federal proceeding." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. "Give me 5 minutes to saddle up. I'll get the horses," Otto said, and was already moving. They rode to town in 20 minutes. Ethan rode with the particular kind of quiet that was not calm, it was contained. She'd learned the difference. Calm was what he was at the kitchen table with his coffee. Contained was what he was when something had genuinely made him angry, and he was choosing not to let it be larger than the situation required. She rode beside him and let him be contained. She was doing her own version of the same thing. Marshall Hurst was at the Bridger Creek lawman's office, which was also the mayor's office, which was also the assay office on Fridays, because small towns combined their official functions out of economic necessity. He was at the desk when they walked in, and he looked at them both and read something in the way they'd walked through the door. "Sit down," he said. She told him about Price. About the timeline arrived. Wednesday evening began talking immediately specific claims designed to poison community perception 3 days before a federal hearing. About Price's history with Ethan. About the impossibility of a man with a 4-year-old grievance showing up in exactly this town at exactly this moment, purely by coincidence. Hurst listened with his complete absolute stillness. Then he said, "Do you have any direct evidence that this man was placed here by Hale?" "Not yet," she said. "Then what you have is suspicious timing and a personal history." "Yes," she said. "But suspicious timing and a personal history in front of a federal judge who already has a 6-year pattern of Hale's conduct is a different thing than what it looks like on its own." Hurst looked at her, then at Ethan. "Mr. Calloway, what do you know about Harlan Price's current financial situation?" Ethan said. "I know he lost his position on 3 drives in a row after the Colorado incident. I know he's been running on bad credit in 2 counties. I know a man in that situation who shows up in a specific town 3 days before a specific hearing is probably not paying his own expenses." Hurst was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to need to speak with Mr. Price." "We'd appreciate that," Caroline said. They stood to leave. Hurst said, "Mrs. Calloway." She turned. He held her gaze with the direct, careful gaze of a man who'd made a decision somewhere in the middle of this conversation. "When I came to your ranch last week and asked Mr. Calloway about this marriage, he didn't defend it. He described it." A pause. "There's a difference. Men who are lying defend things. Men who are telling the truth describe them." She looked at him. "Thank you, Marshall," she said. They walked out into the Bridger Creek afternoon, and Ethan put his hat on, and they stood side by side in the street for a moment. "He's going to pull Price in," Ethan said. "Yes. Price won't hold up under a federal marshal's questioning if Hale didn't pay him enough." "Men like Price never hold up," she said. "That's why Hale uses them. He needs people he can throw away." She felt Ethan go still beside her. "What?" she said. "He's across the street," Ethan said. Quiet. Flat. She looked. Harlan Price was standing outside the saloon, a drink in one hand, and he was looking directly at them. He was a broad, sun-damaged man with the look of someone who'd made a life out of bad choices and was committed to continuing. When he saw that they'd spotted him, he didn't look away. He smiled the deliberate kind. The kind that's meant to be provocative. Ethan took 1 step forward. Caroline put her hand on his arm. He stopped. She didn't say anything. She just left her hand there for a moment, and she felt the tension in him. The real human anger of a man who had been talked about and lied about, and who had a legitimate grievance with the person doing it, and she felt it level out under her hand slowly, the way heat leaves something when you give it enough air. He looked down at her hand. Then he looked back at Price and said from across the street in a voice that carried in the clear Wyoming air with the same flat certainty as everything he said that mattered, "Marshall Hurst would like a word with you." Price's smile went uncertain. Ethan turned away from him completely and looked at Caroline. "Let's go home," he said. She took her hand off his arm. They rode back to Willow Ridge in the long afternoon light, and she thought about what Hurst had said. Men who are telling the truth describe things, and she thought about Ethan in the barn 3 weeks ago telling her about Clara, with his hands still and his voice flat, and his eyes carrying something too old for anger and too controlled for grief. She thought about the way he'd described Wyoming. She never got to see it. "But I stay because I'm finishing something she would have wanted finished." She thought about a broken pocket watch and a father's letter from 22 years ago that said, "Stay 1 more season and see what spring looks like." She thought about the fact that the hearing was in 3 days, and after the hearing, if Ames did what she believed Ames was capable of doing, the debt would be cleared, and Hale would be exposed, and Willow Ridge would stand. And then there would be a conversation. The one that didn't have a script. The one that couldn't be filed with a judge or documented in a ledger managed with a plan. The one where two people decided what was true. She was ready for it. She wasn't afraid of it. That she thought riding home through the gold Wyoming evening beside a man who had become something she hadn't planned for and couldn't undo and didn't want to, that more than anything was how she knew. The night before the hearing, Caroline didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, the old wood contracting in the cooler air, the horses moving in the barn, the distant sound of the creek running low in the summer heat. And she went through everything in her mind, the way you check a fence line before a storm. Every document, every witness, every piece of Ames's strategy laid out in order, tested for weakness, examined for rot. It held. All of it held. That wasn't why she couldn't sleep. She was still awake at midnight when she heard Ethan's door open at the end of the hall. Quiet footsteps, the creak of the porch door. She lay still for a moment, and then she got up. He was sitting on the porch steps with his coffee, looking north toward the ridge where his own property sat in the dark. He didn't turn when she came through the door, but he'd heard her. She knew he'd heard her because she'd learned that Ethan Calloway heard everything. He just chose carefully what to respond to. She sat on the step beside him. He handed her the coffee without a word. She took it, drank, handed it back. They sat in the dark Wyoming night with the stars enormous overhead and the summer air carrying that particular combination of dust and dry grass and something cooler moving down from the mountains. And neither of them spoke for a long time, and it wasn't the silence of two people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had too much to say, and were choosing to let this moment be what it was before the morning made it something else. Finally, Ethan said, "Ames is ready." "I know," she said. "The witnesses are solid. The documentation is as complete as it's going to be." "I know that too." He looked at her. In the dark she could see the outline of his face, the set of his jaw, the particular stillness of him that she had stopped reading as distance approximately 2 weeks ago, and had started reading as what it actually was, a man who had learned to hold himself carefully, because the last time he hadn't, he'd lost everything. "You're not worried about the hearing," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. He was quiet. "Then what?" he said. She looked at the stars. "I'm thinking about after," she said. "Not the legal after, the other kind." He held the coffee cup in both hands, said nothing. Waiting in that way of his, completely present, completely patient, giving her all the room she needed without retreating from it. "I promised you honesty," she said. "On your porch the morning I knocked on your door, you asked me to treat you like a person who made a choice, not a transaction. I said I would." She paused. "So I'm going to be honest now the night before this thing ends, because it seems like the right time, and I don't want to come out the other side of tomorrow still carrying something I should have said." He waited. "I don't want the dissolution," she said. "I told you that already. But I want to tell you why specifically, because you deserve the specific truth, and not just the conclusion." She looked at him. "You came through smoke for me. You sat at this table and went through 3 years of my father's letters at midnight. And you were angry on his behalf, genuinely angry for a man you barely knew, because what was done to him was wrong. You put a fence post back in the ground on my north line, and you didn't tell me about it for 2 days, because you didn't do it for the credit. You told me about Clara without flinching, and you let me see what it cost you, and you didn't make me responsible for it afterward." She stopped. "Let that sit. I've been watching you choose this ranch, choose this situation, choose to stay every day when you could have done the minimum and gone back to your ridge. And I think you should know that I see that. I see it clearly. And I don't want to sign a paper that says it was nothing." Ethan set the coffee down on the step. He was quiet for so long that she thought she might have said too much, pushed through a door he wasn't ready to open. Then he said, "The morning after I lost Clara, I got up before light, and I went out to the property we'd been building in Colorado. I walked every acre of it, and I thought, this is done, not just her, all of it. The thing I'd been building toward. I thought I didn't know how to want anything after that. He stopped. And then I came north, he said. And I bought the ridgeland because it needed someone to buy it, and I was somewhere that needed somewhere to be. And I kept waiting for it to feel like something again, like the point of doing the work. He looked at her. I knocked on your father's door once, 18 months ago, before you and I ever spoke. I was trying to work out the water rights on my east boundary, and I thought he might know the history of the creek line. He invited me in for coffee, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing that had anything to do with water rights. A pause. I came back twice after that, just because. She was very still. I was at his funeral because he was a man who treated me like I was worth talking to when I was at my most determined to make sure nobody could, Ethan said. And when I heard Hale had gone after his land, I was already angry before you knocked on my door. I said yes before you finished asking. I just made you get through the whole ask because I thought you needed to. She stared at him. You already knew you were going to say yes, she said. I knew before I opened the door, he said. She sat with that for a moment. All the careful rehearsing she'd done on the ride over, all the precise, controlled presentation of the case. And he'd decided before she'd said a single word. You let me go through all of it, she said. You needed to say it, he said simply. Sometimes people need to say the thing, not just get the answer. She thought about her father, about what he'd said about men who listen for what's underneath the words. She thought about a pocket watch frozen at 7:42 and a letter at the bottom of a box about staying one more season. Ethan, she said. Yes. I'd like to stay married to you, she said. Not on paper, actually. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, not the fractional almost smile, not the barely there thing she'd been reading for 5 weeks. The real one. She'd never seen the real one before, and it changed his face entirely, not into something unfamiliar, but into something more itself, the way a room looks when someone finally opens the window and lets the light come fully in. Yes, he said, just that. She breathed. They sat on the porch until the eastern edge of the sky started to change, and then she went inside to get dressed for the hearing, and he went to the barn to saddle the horses, and neither of them said anything more about it, because it was said, and it was enough, and there was a full day of consequence ahead of them that needed their full attention. Some things don't need more words. They just need to be true. The federal courtroom in Cheyenne was smaller than she expected, and more formal than anything in Bridger Creek. Dark wood territorial seals the particular weight of official authority that reminded you the decisions made in this room had reach. Judge Walter Crane was 70 years old and had the face of a man who had presided over a great many human disasters and had no patience left for theater. Ames had told them about Crane. He is not impressed by money, not influenced by political connection, and not interested in anything except the merits. He's the best possible judge for this case, and the worst possible judge for Decker Hale. Hale was already in the room when Caroline and Ethan arrived with Ames. She had never seen Decker Hale in person. She knew him only through his letters, through Carter Webb's smooth performance on horseback, through 3 years of documentation of what he did to people's lives. The man sitting across the courtroom was in his 50s, well-dressed in the Cheyenne fashion, with a lawyer beside him, and 2 associates behind him, and the particular composed expression of a man who has always had enough money to make problems go away, and was not yet fully convinced this one would be different. He looked at Caroline when she walked in. She looked back. She didn't look away. She held his gaze for exactly long enough, and then she turned to Ames and said, "Are our witnesses confirmed?" "All 4, Ames said. Greer Connors Aldrich, and a man named Pierce, who lost his spread on the Powder River 3 years back, and has been wanting to tell someone about it ever since." 4, Ethan said quietly beside her. "And the Colorado affidavits," Ames said, "and Hale's own settlement letter, which I intend to introduce as the first piece of evidence, Because I want Judge Crane to see immediately that Hale was trying to make this disappear before it became a record. She looked at Ames. "You've been waiting for this," she said. He adjusted his papers. The ghost of something moved through his expression. "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Calloway, I have watched Decker Hale acquire 7 properties in this territory in 6 years, by methods that just barely legal enough to survive individual challenge. The only way to stop that is to stop seeing them as individual cases." He looked at the judge's bench. "Today they are not individual cases." Judge Crane entered, and everyone stood, and the hearing began. The first hour was procedural. Hale's attorney presenting the fraud complaint in formal language, outlining the allegation that the Calloway marriage was a financial arrangement designed to obstruct a legitimate debt collection. His presentation was polished and confident, and rested on 2 things: Price's testimony, and the general argument that the speed and circumstances of the marriage demonstrated fraudulent intent. Ames sat through all of it with his hands flat on his papers and his face entirely still. When Hale's attorney finished, Crane looked at Ames. "Counselor?" Ames stood. He did not begin with the marriage. He began with the letter. He introduced Hale's settlement offer, the one delivered 3 days before the hearing, offering to retire the debt in exchange for the eastern 40 acres, and he read it aloud slowly and let the courtroom sit with the question of why a man filing a fraud complaint would simultaneously offer to make the underlying debt disappear if the defendant would just sign over land. Hale's attorney was on his feet before Ames finished reading. Crane waved him back down. "Continue," Crane said to Ames. Ames introduced the 6-year pattern next. Not as individual cases, as a documented system. The same structure, the same sequence, the same accelerator clause language appearing verbatim across 5 separate debt instruments in 3 counties. He put the documents side by side and walked Crane through them the way a geologist walks someone through strata. "This is the layer, and this one, and look how they match." Crane read every page Ames put in front of him. The courtroom was very quiet. When Ames called the first witness, Samuel Greer, who had lost his Powder River spread 2 years back, Caroline watched Decker Hale for the first time since the proceedings began. He was still composed. But his attorney had leaned in to speak to him, and the composed expression had developed a specific tension around the eyes. That was the first honest thing she'd seen from that side of the room. Greer testified plainly without embellishment in the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose, and was therefore telling the exact truth. He described the loan structure, the consolidation offer, the accelerator clause, the day he received the vacate notice, the morning he packed his family's belongings and drove them away from land his grandfather had homesteaded. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clerk's pen on paper. Connors testified after Greer. Then Aldrich, who produced the letter from Hale's broker with its explicit misrepresentations, and read the relevant passage aloud in a voice that shook slightly with controlled anger. Then Pierce, who had never testified in any legal proceeding, and who was so nervous he gripped the rail in front of him hard enough to whiten his knuckles, but who said every word he needed to say and didn't omit a single material fact. 4 men, 4 families, 4 properties, 1 pattern. Hale's attorney cross-examined each witness with skill. He was a good lawyer, well prepared, but the pattern was not something cross-examination could dismantle because the pattern wasn't testimony. It was paper. Hale's own paper. His own language, his own clauses, his own signed instruments appearing across 6 years and 7 transactions with the consistency of a man who had found something that worked and saw no reason to change it. When the witnesses were done, Ames called Ethan. Caroline sat very still. Ethan walked to the stand with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, and sat down and looked at Judge Crane with his Creekwater gaze. Hale's attorney went first. He was good. He asked about the speed of the marriage 11 days after Franklin Whitmore's death. He asked about the prior relationship between Ethan and Caroline, minimal direct contact, 2 confirmed meetings before the courthouse. He asked about the financial benefit Ethan stood to gain from the mortgage refinancing. He asked carefully about Colorado, about the accusations, about the timing of Ethan's departure from the South. Ethan answered every question directly, without hesitation, without defensiveness. Yes, the marriage was fast. Yes, he had known Caroline Whitmore only slightly before the courthouse. Yes, he benefited in the sense that his property value was enhanced by stable neighboring land ownership. The Colorado situation, he laid it out himself fully, including the accusation, the timeline, the 3 witnesses who'd confirmed his presence on the drive. He didn't wait to be asked for the uncomfortable parts. He offered them. Because a man offering the hard truths is a different thing than a man being extracted from them, and Crane was exactly the kind of judge who knew the difference. Then Ames stood. "Mr. Calloway," Ames said, "in the 5 weeks since your marriage to Mrs. Calloway, have you lived at Willow Ridge Ranch?" "Yes." "Have you worked that ranch?" "Every day." "Have you contributed to its maintenance and operation?" "Yes." "When Mrs. Calloway was endangered by a grass fire on the property, what did you do?" "I went through the fire to get to her." Ames paused. "Let that sit." "Is Willow Ridge Ranch your home?" he said. Ethan looked at Caroline from the stand. Directly. Without any performance or announcement of what he was doing. Just the honest, complete eye contact of a man answering a question from the only source that could give him the true answer. "Yes," he said. "It is." Ames said, "Nothing further." The courtroom was quiet. Then Caroline was called. She walked to the stand and sat and looked at Judge Crane and felt surprisingly entirely calm. Not the controlled calm of managed anxiety. Real calm, the kind that comes from telling the truth. Hale's attorney tried the same structure with her, the speed, the arrangement, the financial motivation. She answered clearly. Yes, she had approached Ethan with a practical proposal. Yes, the marriage had legal and financial utility. Yes, she had known what she was doing and why. And then she said, "And I also know that in the 5 weeks since I have come to understand that I married a man of complete integrity, genuine kindness, and moral seriousness, that I did not expect and could not have manufactured for the purposes of any legal proceeding." If that combination of practical arrangement and genuine reality troubles Mr. Hale, I would suggest that his trouble is with human nature, which does not arrange itself neatly into either purely practical or purely romantic categories, but tends to find its own truth somewhere more complicated than either. Hale's attorney looked at her. She looked back. Judge Crane made a sound, just a sound small controlled that might in a less formal context have been interpreted as approval. When both testimonies were complete, Ames made his closing argument, which was not long because the pattern had already made the case, and what remained was simply naming what it was. Systematic, deliberate, documented predation against rural landowners using debt instruments designed to appear legitimate while containing structural traps that guaranteed default. He asked the court to dismiss the fraud complaint, to enter the full documented pattern into the federal territorial record, and to refer the matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review of potential criminal violations of federal land statutes. Hale's attorney argued for 40 minutes. Crane listened with complete attention and gave no indication of what he was thinking. Then he called a recess. Caroline and Ethan and Ames sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Ames drank water and said nothing, and Ethan sat beside her with his elbows on his knees, and she could feel the tension in him, not fear, but the particular alertness of a man waiting for an outcome. He's done everything in his power to shape and now has to release. She put her hand over his. He turned it over and held it. They sat like that in the hallway of a federal courthouse in Cheyenne, with the summer heat pressing against the windows and the sound of the building moving around them. And she thought about 5 weeks ago when she'd sat on the courthouse steps in Bridger Creek in her best dress, pressing her father's broken watch to her chest. And she thought about how much had changed, and how none of the changes had been what she'd planned for, and how that was the nature of staying one more season. You couldn't predict what spring was going to look like. You just had to trust the staying. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Crane returned to the bench, he looked at both tables for a moment before he spoke. "The fraud complaint filed by Mr. Hale is dismissed," he said. "The court finds no credible evidence that the marriage between Ethan Calloway and Caroline Calloway was fraudulent in nature or intent. The court further finds that the documentary evidence presented by the defense constitutes a sufficient pattern of potentially unlawful conduct to warrant referral to the U.S. Attorney for the Territory of Wyoming. He looked at Hale directly. Mr. Hale, I would strongly advise you to retain experienced legal counsel, not for these proceedings which are concluded, for what comes next. He stood. Everyone stood. He walked out. The courtroom held its breath for one moment. Then it broke into sound and movement, and Ames was on his feet and shaking Ethan's hand, and Greer was across the room with his eyes red, and Connors had his wife's hand, and Aldrich said something under his breath that was mostly profanity, and entirely justified, and Caroline stood in the middle of all of it, and watched Decker Hale across the room. He was standing very still. His attorney was speaking to him, and he wasn't listening. He was looking at the floor, and for the first time in all of this, he looked like what he actually was. Not a powerful man, not a strategic man, just a man who had built something rotten and watched it named for what it was in front of a federal record that would follow him for the rest of his career. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that. Something more like the feeling after a long fever breaks the absence of the thing that had been consuming you and the strange, clean space that absence leaves. Ethan came to stand beside her. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the room at Greer and Connors and Aldrich and Pierce at Ames, gathering his papers with the careful satisfaction of a man who has done exactly what he set out to do at the empty judge's bench, where a federal record now existed that had not existed this morning. "Your father's letters," he said. 3 years of keeping them. He didn't know why it mattered. He knew, she said. He just didn't know how. Ethan looked at her. She looked back. They walked out of the courthouse into the Cheyenne afternoon together, and she didn't take his arm the way people expect a woman to take a man's arm coming out of a courthouse, and he didn't offer it the way men offer things out of performance rather than intention. They just walked out side by side into the heat and the light, and that was enough. That was exactly right. Ames caught them on the steps. "The U.S. Attorney's referral will take time," he said. "Months possibly. But it's in the record now. It can't be unfiled." He paused. "And the mortgage refinancing, I'll have the application processed by end of week. With the fraud complaint dismissed and the documentary record established, there's no legitimate basis for Pitt or anyone else to obstruct it." "Thank you, Silas," Caroline said. He looked at her over his papers. "Your father was a careful man," he said. "He would have been proud of how you used what he kept." She didn't trust her voice all the way. She nodded. Ames walked to his office. They walked to their horses. The ride back to Bridger Creek was 2 hours, and they rode most of it in the kind of quiet that had become comfortable between them. Not empty, not managed, just easy. The silence of two people who had learned each other well enough that being in the same space didn't require constant filling. About halfway home, Ethan said, "We should tell Otto." "He'll have heard before we get back," she said. "Otto always knows." Ethan considered this. Probably true. A pause. "The Ridgeland," he said. "My 40 acres. I'd been thinking about running a larger herd next season. The south pasture at Willow Ridge, the acreage would support it once it's reseeded." She looked at him. "Are you asking me a ranching question or a different kind of question?" "Both," he said. She thought about the south pasture, about the reseeding, about the spring, the actual spring, the season, the one that came after the winter, that came after the long burning summer that had changed everything. The south pasture would support a larger herd, she said. The combined acreage makes sense, operationally. A pause. "And every other way?" He nodded. They rode on. When Willow Ridge came into sight, the main house, the barn, the fences, the ridge behind it all showing in the late afternoon light, Caroline felt something she hadn't felt since she'd first read Hale's letter. Not relief exactly. Something more fundamental than relief. She felt like she was coming home. Not because the threat was gone. Not because the legal crisis was resolved and the debt would be cleared and the land would stand. Those things mattered. But that wasn't the feeling. The feeling was the house with the light in it. The fence lines that two people had walked and tested and repaired together. The south trough that pumped clean and strong because someone had cared enough to fix it on the first morning without being asked. The porch where they'd sat in the dark the night before and told each other the true things. She pulled her horse up at the gate and reached into her pocket and took out the pocket watch. She turned it over in her hands. The cracked glass. The hands frozen at 7:42. Stopped the morning her father went into the ground. Stopped as though the world itself had needed a moment to register what had been lost. She looked at Ethan. He was watching her. "My father wrote my mother a letter once," she said. "Before I was born. He said he didn't know if the ranch was worth what it cost. But he said walking away from hard things had never made him a man he wanted to be. So he stayed another season." Ethan held her gaze. "He stayed," she said. "And it turned out to be everything." Something moved through Ethan's face, deep and real, and unguarded, in the way he only let himself be when he'd decided the moment deserved it. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's how it works." She put the watch back in her pocket and opened the gate, and they rode into the yard, and Otto was already there. Of course, Otto was already there, sitting on the fence rail, with his hat on, and his arms crossed. And when he saw their faces, he uncrossed his arms and said nothing, which from Otto was the equivalent of a standing ovation. That evening she made supper, and Ethan brought in wood for the stove, even though the July heat made it unnecessary, and Otto ate with them for the first time, and talked more in that 1 hour than she'd heard him talk in 5 weeks, which turned out to mean about 40 words total, but each one landed with the weight of a much longer sentence. At one point he said, looking at neither of them and at the far wall, "Your father's ranch is in good hands." And then he went back to eating. She didn't look at Ethan. She didn't have to. After supper, Ethan washed the dishes and she dried them, and they worked at the sink with their shoulders occasionally touching in the narrow kitchen space, neither of them adjusting, and the summer dark was coming down outside, and somewhere on the north ridge a nightbird was doing what nightbirds do, and the ranch was quiet in the way it had been quiet for 5 weeks, occupied, present, alive. She put the last dish on the rack and turned. He was already looking at her. She took the pocket watch from her pocket one more time and held it up between them, the cracked glass, the frozen hands. "I'm going to get this fixed," she said. "In town, next week." He looked at it, then at her. "Yes," he said. "Time's moving again." She put it on the windowsill above the sink where the morning light would hit it, and reached up and turned down the lamp, and the kitchen went to dark. And outside, Willow Ridge Ranch stood on its Wyoming ground, all its fences whole, and its pastures breathing, and its deed clear, and its future its own. And inside it, 2 people had built something that had started as necessity and become without permission or plan. The truest thing either of them had found in a very long time. Willow Ridge did not need saving anymore. It needed living in. And for the first time since the morning she'd pressed her father's watch against her chest on a courthouse step in her best dress. Caroline Whitmore. Caroline Calloway knew without question that she was exactly the woman who was going to do it.